Analysis by a financial journalist has found the government's COVID-19 policies have made the wealthy hundreds of billions of dollars richer, while the poor sunk $400 million further into debt to the government itself. Bernard Hickey says the explosion in inequality has been driven by government and Reserve Bank interventions, including quantitative easing, effectively the printing of money, which has been blamed in part for the fuelling of the surge in house prices over the past 2 years. While asset holders have seen their balance sheets surge, by the middle of last year, debt owed to the Ministry of Social Development by beneficiaries had risen by $400 million to $1 billion. Bernard Hickey, formerly of interest.co.nz, now writing the political and economic blog The Kaka, says the Labour government, supported by the Green Party, has presided over the biggest transfer of wealth from current and future renters to asset owners in the history of New Zealand. His analysis is based on Stats NZ data, and he's here to work through his sums. Kia ora. Welcome, Bernard.
Oh, kia ora.
How did you work this out? What data did you use?
So Stats NZ puts out figures, national accounts figures, which look at what households and businesses and the government have done with their cash and what their net worth is every quarter. So you can effectively follow the money through the COVID crisis and compare it with what's happened before the crisis. And what we can see, according to Stats NZ, is that the government gave almost $20 billion in cash in wage subsidies and in resurgence payments to businesses. And the Reserve Bank bought over $50 billion worth of government bonds, effectively through money printing. And there were results of that. The net worth of businesses rose by more than $300 billion, and the net worth of households over that COVID period rose by more than $600 billion. And the point of the analysis from the Stats NZ numbers is to look at the effects on inequality now that we're 21 months on from the beginning of COVID. And what we can see is that COVID has actually been fantastic for people who already had assets at the beginning of the crisis. But for those people who are renters and who don't have assets, they're now significantly worse off because the government didn't give them much more cash at all, only an extra $48 million in special cash payments. And their incomes have been whittled away by inflation, as we're about to hear later this morning.
Let's look at some of this a bit more closely. Businesses may have received wage subsidies, but many were still well down on their normal revenue. The picture for business itself is very much one of two halves, isn't it?
That's right. At least initially, a lot of those businesses really needed that cash, or thought they needed it. But within 3 or 4 months, it was clear that the economy was recovering quite strongly. And in the end, when you look at their profits that are reported by Stats NZ, for the 21 months after COVID, businesses made a gross operating surplus, so what you'd describe as profit, of $27 billion. Well, that doesn't mean much unless you look at the previous period before COVID. And the profit there was only $11.6 billion. So what we've seen here is that businesses increased their collective profits by $15.5 billion, which magically is not much different from the extra $18.9 billion they were given in cash by the government. Now, understandably, the money was handed over very fast by MSD because it was needed. But what we've seen is now that we know that the economy rebounded quickly, there's been very little attempt to claw that money back. Whereas when you look at how MSD and the government handle people who have asked for special needs grants or borrowed money from MSD, the government's very aggressive at claiming that money back from people on benefits. So I think it's worth looking at where the cash went, where it is now, and why the government and businesses are not working together to give that money back, because it's no small amount. We're talking at least $15 billion extra in profits that businesses made over that period. And when you look at their net worth, which of course rose as property prices rose they're $300 billion richer. So the danger here is that our response to COVID from both the government and the Reserve Bank, and remember the Reserve Bank got the government's approval before they started the money printing, the end result of that has been an absolutely massive increase in inequality. Those people who were renters, who didn't have assets at the start of COVID, are now so much further behind those who had assets. And anyone who wants to jump the gap, if you like, to be able to buy their first home, they're now completely out of options, in part because that rise in inequality and in house prices has forced the Reserve Bank to make it much harder to borrow money. So, in effect, COVID was the moment that blew away a generation's hope for their first home. And at the same time, those people who went into COVID on precarious incomes, low incomes, are now much, much worse off because rents, as we've seen today from Trade Me, have risen twice as fast as wages, and the costs that poor people tend to have to pay, and remember, they're spending 100% of their income on goods and services as opposed to people who have a lot of assets and cash. They're not spending their money so much on goods and services. They're able to save. That has meant that the inflation explosion has hurt them much more than the rest of society. So not only have we seen an increase in inequality in wealth terms, but also in real incomes.
Okay, two things to work through. First, the counterfactual. Was there an alternative to the actions, and if so, what would the consequences of the alternative have been? And second, will there be a correction? Let's deal with the first one first. The simplicity, as you said, of the wage subsidy has been credited with being one of the reasons why businesses in the economy were actually reasonably resilient in that early phase. Now, you can argue whether we should be going back and trying to get more money back out of businesses that did not need it in the end. We can argue about that. It's going to take a lot of time and bureaucracy and also potentially undermines the social contract that accompanied the wage subsidy, but I'm happy to have that argument. The point is this: what would you have done otherwise? Would you not have had the kind of quantitative easing that central banks around the world all did, remembering at the outset they were desperately fearful of a Great Depression?
Yes, there's two things that the government and the Reserve Bank could have done differently, and both of them are pretty conventional in economic policy terms. Firstly, you're right, in those few weeks in March 2020, everyone thought we were going to have some sort of depression, and the reassurance of getting cash straight into your bank account as an employer was incredibly helpful, and I'm sure reduced the number of people being made unemployed, and avoided the sort of spiral of sackings that you see in some sort of depression, and we certainly saw during the 1929-30 depression. However, it was pretty clear within 3 or 4 months that businesses had bounced back, and the payments kept going. And of course, we've seen another round of payments this year. There's also been very little reflection by the government on how useful the wage subsidies were and where the money has gone. And I thought it was useful to actually see, where is the money? And it turned out it's gone pretty much into bank accounts that businesses and households have. And we hear a lot about how money is short.
How have you realised that?
So Stats NZ's numbers show what the cash holdings are of businesses collectively and households collectively. And between the beginning of COVID and the end of COVID, businesses collectively increased their cash balances and term deposits by $26 billion.
We're back to that figure we had earlier. Right.
Yeah, and households increased their cash balances by $25 billion. So in effect, that tens of billions of dollars of government cash, which the government had to borrow, effectively went straight into the cash accounts of businesses.
Well, it went into the cash accounts of some, and this is the problem again. There are clearly businesses that have done exceptionally well out of this pandemic. supermarkets would be one. If you're the manufacturer of a particular kind of, PPE gear, you're doing very nicely. If you're into software as a service with the massive transition to work from home, you're doing very nicely. But there are other businesses out there whose own homes and savings are going into trying to stay afloat. So I guess this was always the sort of elegance of the wage subsidy, but also the fact it would inevitably be unfair.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. For a lot of businesses, they did struggle. But many of those small businesses regularly struggle and frankly only exist because they're able to access the continually rising and leveraged equity in their own homes or in their own property. And the value of those homes and property rose by a combined $952 billion post-COVID. Okay. You mentioned earlier that one of the reasons for the help from the government for businesses was to fulfill a social contract. And that's understandable. The whole point of a government helping people in need is to be sure that they are in need. But what the government didn't do was have a question, at least after the panic had finished, had the question, do you really need this money? And what we know from the publicly reported accounts of many businesses that are either listed companies or are part of overseas companies where they have to report their results, shows that there are many companies still that made big profits and paid big dividends to their shareholders, often overseas, who refuse to pay back the wage subsidies. And they include the likes of Harvey Norman, Kathmandu, Fulton Hogan, and many, many others. And I'm really surprised that the business community are not, frankly, embarrassed that as a collective whole, they have just taken $19 billion from the taxpayers of New Zealand, seen their assets rise by almost $1 trillion, and are not looking to repay that, to rebuild the social contract that we had.
For context, $49 billion a year is spent on social security and welfare. That probably includes superannuation. So that is for context. I guess this one-off business welfare, not that the social contract wasn't just the need, it was also legally requiring people to cease trading and cease their income. So that was an element as well. I'm not arguing against you, by the way. I'm just teasing out the various strands of this morally, I guess.
And you're right. When the government passes a law that forces you to stop your business and to limit what you can do as a business, who you can employ, when you can employ them, what they can do, I understand there's a need for a response. But when you look over time, once the panic has finished, then you look at whether what happened was fair. And what we have is that the taxpayers of New Zealand have paid over $19 billion to businesses, and over that time, their profits rose by $15.5 billion, and that was paid out as dividends or captured as a rise in the equity in the businesses.
Let's talk about the other big driver of this, which is the insane rise in house prices over these 2 years. It's hard to call it anything else, the speed at which it's gone up. My point to you, again, that was a side effect of what was deemed at the time anyway to be a necessary response to a possibly catastrophic economic shock. We could argue again whether quantitative easing went on too long. Plenty will. We're going to be arguing about the response to this pandemic for the next 5 decades. It will be filling academic textbooks. A not surprising side effect was the inflation in house prices. It was surprising because people thought we'd have higher unemployment and that would affect the housing market. That's not what happened. My point to you earlier was, will there be a correction? Now, corrections have been forecast and have not happened for many years in New Zealand. You're well aware of that, but we have had this situation of high immigration outstripping the building of houses. That does appear to potentially be on the turn. And are the immediate gains out of this pandemic in house price and other asset prices necessarily going to be sustained?
No. In theory, we're going to see some sort of fall in house prices. The question is how much. Now, we know in December there was a 1% fall in the house price index, and we've seen from some banks forecasts of another fall of another 6 or 7%. But remember, we've seen prices rise more than 40% since COVID. And there were two things that went on here. Firstly, the Reserve Bank did print money and buy government bonds to lower longer-term interest rates, and that was successful in pumping up asset values. And that was the point. The wealth effect was one way in which the government and the Reserve Bank wanted to support the economy.
Because people spend more when they feel wealthier.
Yes, although not much more. The Reserve Bank's own research shows that for every $1 of an increase in a household's net worth, they only spend an extra 3 cents. So that's not a particularly efficient way to boost your economy. The trouble is, when you do it the other way around, when you reduce the value of someone's net worth, their spending reduces by 6 cents. So in effect, the wealth effect is doubly painful, twice as painful as beneficial on the other way around. So the issue here is what's stopping the government and the Reserve Bank from unwinding this stimulus and unwinding the 40% rise in house prices? Firstly, the government has said, the Prime Minister has said that one of her roles is to protect the main savings vehicle of most families, which is the house. So in effect, the government has given an implicit guarantee that house prices only ever ratchet up. And when they go down, they don't go down by much. And that's certainly what we saw in 2008-9, when prices only fell by 9 to 10%. One of the reasons there is that the Reserve Bank has control of a couple of tools, a couple of dials, if you like, to stimulate and to decelerate. And one of the big mistakes, I think, at the beginning of the COVID crisis was the Reserve Bank's complete removal of all LVR restrictions at the same time as lowering interest rates and giving banks a nod to say, go for your life. We then had an 18-month frenzy of lending to people who were leveraging up the equity in their own homes to buy rental property. Now, that's one way to stimulate an economy, but once you've done it, you need to have another look at whether it worked. The second problem is that the Reserve Bank, you're right, did what every other central bank in the world did, which was to do quantitative easing. Now, in retrospect, everyone who's looked at this has said, yes, well, you're effectively doing social policy as a central bank because you are engineering an increase in inequality. And that's not what central banks should be doing. And there were different ways to do it. For example, the Reserve Bank and the government could have relied a lot more on fiscal policy. And what a lot of other countries did was simply give one-off significant cash handouts equally to everyone at the same time. And that meant that a lot of people who were poor were spending 100% of that cash payout instead of saving it. And you also get a much fairer stimulus than what we saw, which was the Reserve Bank and the government using a massive increase in the net worth of people who already had assets to stimulate the economy, and then a refusal to unwind it once it had happened. That has changed New Zealand society for decades to come, and the scale of it is enormous. We're talking $1 trillion in less than 2 years of wealth landed into the hands of people who were already wealthy, at the same time as the government, for example, last Christmas, refused to increase the benefits at Christmas by $50 because they were worried that it would increase the government's debts.
That wealth,
when you've just increased the government...
That wealth, though, so much of it, to your point, is paper wealth in an asset that may or may not be a rental property. It may be one's own property. And we're in this sort of false, sort of Alice in Wonderland world where to buy a new property, you sell your own property and you're actually not any the better off if you're in the same market. And it is also that paper wealth that is vulnerable to a significant correction. Look, on the face of it, Bernard, no one can disagree with the word that you're saying. I guess what I'm getting to is what do we do about it now? And what do we see coming in the next year or two that will not close this enormous gap that pre-existed and is now larger? but it may not be as extreme as it is sitting here right now, January 2022. Like, what do you see happening the next year or two, and particularly in that housing market, fickle as it is to predict?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to get into the business of predicting house prices. But what we do know is that in the past, New Zealand house prices have ratcheted up. And when they've come back down, they've come back down in a much smaller and marginal way compared to when they went up. In part because when governments are under pressure and need to ensure the housing market stays up, they use their own policies, and the Reserve Bank has used policies to keep the market stable.
40% in 2 years. Has that ever happened before in our modern history? This is where one wonders whether that paper figure really is vulnerable this time.
Well, the best way to test it would be for a government to say that some of that paper figure isn't real, and that homeowners should be prepared to give some of it up as a wealth tax. And that's the other argument as well, that you could say to businesses that your net worth, according to your own accounting and your own auditors, is worth X. And we think it's worth taking some of that back because you were the beneficiary of enormous government support. And remember, too, that a lot of businesses went into COVID, some of them had relatively high debts, and in effect, they were rewarded for running close to the wind going into COVID and not having a base of savings to use for themselves in a shock. We hear a lot about being prepared for rainy days, but it always seems to be the government that has to step up and bail out people who haven't prepared for that rainy day.
That debt to MSD hit $1 billion by the middle of last year, so goodness knows what it is now, gone up by 400 million. And it comes at an interesting time too. I'm reading this morning about the credit union saying, we now can't lend to people we normally top up by, $50 a week so they can put food on the table. We work with them for budgeting advice, but sometimes they need top-ups to feed their kids. And we are seeing, as a result of another piece of lawmaking, the real risk that people are moving from credible lenders into the jaws of predatory lenders because of another piece of government policy of late. Mm-hmm. What is your view on that loan to MSD, what it shows and how it should be handled?
Well, there have been various calls from people covering this sector, helping people in trouble, to say that money should be forgiven. That would certainly help a lot of people who are under an awful lot of stress at the moment. And questions about some of the cash grants that are given as loans rather than grants, which force people to repay them. So forgiving that debt, and frankly doing what the Welfare Expert Advisory Group said the government should do nearly 3 years ago now, which is to increase incomes substantially.